Thank you so much for joining us today at Science Outside. Really appreciate having you here and you giving us some of your time. I just wanted to give you a quick introduction. You have been a professor at the University of Delaware, part of the faculty since 1981. You're in the Entomology and Wildlife Ecology Department, and your research has focused on the behavior of ecology of insects, conservation of biodiversity, impact of invasive plants on native ecosystems, and plant-insect interactions. You have 105 publications, which is amazing. You've mentored dozens of graduate students and postdoctoral students, authored several books, including Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, and Nature of Oaks, which just came out this spring. You're an advocate for the homeowner to convert part of their lawn or half their lawn to a home garden or as you have mentioned, landscape that provides essential habitats for native species. I hope I got it all, or just a good synopsis.
Yeah, that's a good start.
Just diving in, Science Outside serves high school teachers and high school students, and we cover a lot of curriculum, so it's really nice to have you to give a fresh perspective to our students. So I just wanted to go through a bunch of questions, and hopefully we can have a good conversation about some of your work. So I just wanted to start off, if you could please provide us with an overview describing the impact of invasive species on ecosystems here in the United States.
Okay, well, there are several types of invasive species. We've got invasive animals, we've got invasive insects. I focus mostly on invasive plants, although very briefly, invasive insects are eating our plants, so they're destroying native plants in the same way that invasive plants are destroying native plants. The definition of an invasive species is a non-native species that's displacing native species. And there are very few places in the country where you can go where there aren't a lot of invasive plants, pretty much everywhere. As a matter of fact, it's been measured that in most ecosystems, particularly in the East, about a third of the vegetation, no matter where you are, it might look pristine and green, but about a third of the vegetation is from Asia. So that means you've lost a third of the native plants. And the big problem is the non-native plants are very poor at supporting the food web. They're very poor at passing the energy they capture from the sun on to other animals. And if it stays locked up in their leaves, in other words, if nothing eats them, you have a collapsed food web. And then you don't have those other animals. And that's a problem, not just because we would miss our animals, but it is biodiversity. It's the plants and animals around us that run the ecosystems that support us. You've probably heard of the term ecosystem services. That's the life support systems that keep humans alive, everything else alive as well. But and the more species you have in an ecosystem, the more ecosystem services that system produces. So when we humans run around and develop landscapes or allow these invasive plants to take over, we're decreasing the number of species in those ecosystems and really downgrading their ability to produce the ecosystem services that we all need. That's the big problem.
I'm here in Georgia at the moment in the mountains, and I've seen a lot of kudzu, and it's just completely taken over both sides of the rivers, both sides of the highway, thousands, millions of acres. And I just wanted to know, I know that they've done a lot of controlled burns and that kind of thing, but is there really any way to combat it? It just seems like an overwhelming issue.
Yeah, it's really tough. Burns make you feel good and they kill the above ground vegetation, but they never kill the root system. So in terms of actually controlling the problem, it's not a good solution. I always talk about the responsibility of individual landowners. East of the Mississippi, 85, almost 86% of the land is privately owned. So if we chopped up this job and said every landowner is responsible for getting rid of the invasive species on his or her property, the kudzu, the privet, the bush honeysuckle, the barberry, the burning bush, all of these guys, that chops it up into manageable jobs. Now, if you own a lot of property, it's a big job for sure. But if everybody got rid of the invasive species on their property, we'd be 85% done.
That's amazing.
As opposed to saying, well, it's such a giant job. It is a big job, but there's a lot of us too. It's an opportunity for employment.
That's true.
Invasive species removal.
I just get a few 100,000 people and $15 an hour. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. No, that's a good cause. It's interesting.
We also have to stop selling them in our nurseries.
That's true. You go to Home Depot or Lowe's.
Yeah, most of the invasive plants we have are ornamentals that we still sell in our nurseries. So it doesn't make sense to be combating them in our natural areas and selling them in nurseries.
Yeah,
And
of
we're
course.
getting better at that. Bredford pear, Callery pear, everywhere, and it's a top selling ornamental. So,
Like you said, privet is,
yeah,
and that's an ornamental tree. Then you have wisteria. Wisteria is beautiful when it blooms, but it
yeah,
takes over everything, right?
yeah, it does. Yeah.
You can't get rid of it. Um, I guess what I wanted to ask, are there any positives that have come out of invasive plants or species?
Well, you mentioned kudzu. Kudzu was planted widely as a soil erosion control, and people say, well, that's a positive. But first of all, that implies that there are no native plants that can control soil erosion, which is ridiculous. Of course, there are. And what you have to do is you have to look at the net benefit or the net loss of a particular invasive species. Even if you gain something, like kudzu supports the silver-spotted skipper, but at the same time, when you have a kudzu invasion, you lose thousands of other species. So you gain one, lose thousands. Look at the total net gain or loss, and then you can decide whether they're positives. And I don't know of any invasive species of any kind where the positives outweigh the negatives. It's usually vastly tilted towards the negative.
It's really interesting. I know that I'm kind of jumping around with our questions here, but goldenrod is probably one of the strongest native plants. I know trees are going to be your number one, and then plants are the second tier, but goldenrod seems to, according to your website, actually, we'll mention that later, but on native species, when you do the research, it supports 82 butterflies and moth plants, the goldenrod, and it's very, very aggressive and fights. I just wanted to know, how does it stand up against some of the invasive species that swoop through the area?
Well, first of all, you're talking about the genus Solidago, and there's a lot of species of goldenrod. Some of them really are aggressive, like Canada goldenrod. And if you're trying to fight things like one of the invasive plants we have at our house is Japanese stiltgrass. It's a real problem. Goldenrod can hold its own against Japanese stiltgrass, and very few other things do. That's Canada goldenrod. Okay. Many other goldenrods are clump goldenrods, and they don't spread as well. And that's a plus with landscaping. A lot of people don't want to use Canada goldenrod because it kind of takes over everything. But you're right; it's a very important genus. In the Mid-Atlantic states, it supports 110 species of caterpillars. And let me just briefly mention, supporting caterpillars is a good thing because caterpillars are the main way that energy from plants is transferred to vertebrates. Most vertebrates, particularly birds, don't eat plants directly. They eat the invertebrates that ate the plants. Those invertebrates, of course, are insects, but most of the insects that are passing the energy on are caterpillars. So when you have a plant that makes a lot of caterpillars, you have a very diverse and complex and stable food web. And that's what runs our ecosystem. So you can measure the quality of your local ecosystem just by counting the caterpillar species that it supports. And if you have a plant like goldenrod that supports a lot, that's great. As opposed to kudzu that supports 1, or crepe myrtle 0, or so yeah, ginkgos 0. But one good thing about crepe myrtles is they're not invasive. They don't move around. But we do plant them everywhere. So
yes, yeah, exactly. On your own property, especially, you said you're combating like stiltgrass and that kind of thing. What kind of strategies can we teach our students, teach people across America to use to combat these invasives? And my brother-in-law has read your books, and he has actually been working hard to turn his home yard into a beautiful garden. He's using natives and just kind of drowning out the invasives by just overplanting the natives and pulling the invasives when he can. But just curious on your take on it.
Well, there's a lot of strategies. It depends on what the plant is.
True.
So we live in Southeast Pennsylvania. That area wants to be a forest. So it was mowed for hay when we moved in. So one of the things we did was plant a whole lot of trees, and that did create a lot of shade that then depresses things like multiflora rose and autumn olive. But we also pulled those plants out. Our neighbors haven't done that. So there's a constant reinvasion of little guys. But once you get the big guys out, the little ones are much easier to get rid of. You have to kill the root system, where they just keep coming back and back and back. A lot of people don't want to use herbicides at all. But again, you got to measure the costs and the benefits. There are costs to using herbicides, but if you use them correctly and use them minimally, so I like to cut off the stump of a plant like a privet, cut it off, and then you paint that. That's very little material.
Mm-hmm.
You do kill the roots, and then you're done. Whereas if you just cut it off, it'll keep coming back for the rest of your life, and you haven't gained that much. If you don't control your invasives, the ecological costs are enormous, and they do outweigh in my opinion, any of the downsides of using herbicides. So I think of herbicides as like chemotherapy. I mean, you can say, well, I don't want to use any chemicals in my body, but I've got cancer cells growing, and invasive plants are ecological cancers. You can let the cancer go in order to not use chemicals, but then you die. So sometimes you have to do something that's nasty in order to get a big benefit at the end.
Just help keep everything in check, sure.
But my wife has done most of the invasive controls on her property. She won't use herbicides, and she simply stays after it. She clips and cuts and pulls and clips and cuts and pulls. And you can exhaust the root system by doing that repeatedly. And in the end, you can win, but it is a lot of work.
Labor of love.
So Number one is don't buy them.
That's the message here.
And then work on the ones you already do have.
Most of the issue is just education.
Well, the main message to our kids and their parents is that we think of plants as decorations. Mm-hmm. And that's the way the horticultural trade treats them. So it doesn't matter what plant you use as long as it's pretty. Mm-hmm. And I understand that. They are pretty. They are decorations. Right. But they have critical ecological roles too. So if we choose our plants based not just on aesthetics, but also on ecological function, then we're on the right road. And then you can say, well, which plant is doing what needs to be done at my house? There are 4 things that has to be done at everybody's property. One is support that food web so that you have the birds and all the other life around you. That means native plants, because the non-natives don't do that. Sure. The second thing is support a diverse, complex community of pollinators, because you don't have the plants without the pollinators. So our pollinators are pollinating 90% of our flowering plants. It's not just about agriculture. So you need the particular plants that are good at supporting not just any pollinator, but the specialist pollinators. So for example, we've got 4,000 species of native bees in this country, and over a third of them, so 1,300, 1,400, are specialized on particular plants. And you mentioned goldenrod. There are, almost 20 species of bees that will only reproduce in the pollen of goldenrod. Now, the generalist bees, like honeybees and many of the bumblebees, will use goldenrod too. So if you plant for the specialists, then you saved all the bees. Wow. We also want to manage the watershed. Everybody lives in a watershed, and nobody has the ethical right to destroy that watershed. And the biggest watershed destroyer, other than paving it over, is lawn. So if acres of lawn, and we've got more than 40 million acres of lawn in this country.
Wow, that's incredible.
That's an area bigger than New England. But that's why I talk about cut the area of lawn in half, because lawn destroys the watershed. And it doesn't support pollinators, and it doesn't support the food. It doesn't do anything we need to do. No. The 4th thing we need to do is sequester carbon, pull carbon out of the atmosphere, tie it up in plant material. And again, lawn is the worst at doing that. Mm-hmm. So any plant will grab carbon and put it in their tissues, and then deposit a lot of carbon in the soil. That's really important. But plants that are long-lived, dense, and have big root systems do that better than other plants. So I'm thinking of oaks as number 1. Oaks are number 1 in terms of carbon sequestration. They're number 1 in terms of supporting the food web. And they're number 1 in watershed management, because they have huge root systems and a big canopy that breaks up the pounding rain. Can turn your yard from an ecological dead zone into something that's vibrant, that's actually enhancing your local ecosystem instead of degrading it.
Now, you mentioned the watershed. I mean, obviously you're speaking about the recharge, the aquifers and all of that. And I know that a lot of people are hosting like water features on their own property and that kind of thing. Can you speak to that at all? Are there any benefits of having a water feature? And if so, what kind of water feature do you need, and how big does it have to be?
Yeah, particularly if you're a bird watcher, you want birds in your yard. And particularly if you don't live near a source of water. So if you live right next to a stream or a river, water features don't do that much.
Sure.
By water feature, I'm talking about any source of water that is circulating. And it's ideal if it makes a noise, a little babbling, dribbling noise, because that's what attracts the birds. Because that means it's moving water and that it's clean. A stagnant pool is not something that attracts the birds. So they want to hear, it sounds like a little stream. And when they hear that, They'll come over and they'll drink and they'll take a bath. And it can be a really effective way to bring birds into your yard, particularly if you live in an area where there's not a lot of other water.
Okay. So just even a small fountain.
Small fountain, even a dripping hose.
Really? Okay.
A little hose with a slow drip on a, make a little splash block. You'd be surprised how many things that attracts. So
wow, that's cool.
Doesn't have to be fancy.
That's really interesting. That's cool. And so this is kind of changing gears a little bit, but what's your stance on cultivars of native plants? People who are taking a native plant and adapting it.
Well, cultivar it's a genetic variant of a straight species.
Sure.
So you can have cultivars of non-native plants, you can have cultivars of native plants, and it's just a slice of the genome that makes up that particular species. And it typically enhances a particular trait. So it makes a tall plant short, or a green leaf red or purple, or a single flower, a double flower, and so on. So the question is, are they as good as the straight species, particularly if you're buying cultivars of native plants? And the answer is, it depends on what the genetic change was. And we did a study comparing 6 cultivar traits that are very common for woody plants. So we weren't looking at flower traits. We were looking at the habit of the plant. Again, taking a tall plant and making it short, or changing leaf color, enhancing berry size, introducing disease resistance. What did that do to insect use of those plants? And it was a 3-year common garden experiment where they're all growing next to each other. And what we found is that the only cultivar traits that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because that loads the leaf with a chemical called anthocyanins that are feeding deterrents.
Okay.
Love our red leaf cultivars. I'm not sure why, because I think they're ugly. But they're very popular. But when you do that, you're taking a plant that's very functional and making it a non-functional plant, just for that aesthetic trait. The news with flowers is not so good. Annie White is a woman in Vermont who's looked at that. It's a big question because there's thousands of cultivars out there. It is possible to have a cultivar that actually makes more pollen and more nectar. And there's some examples of like Phlox paniculated Jenna is found in Georgia, as a matter of fact. It was a natural variant found in Georgia, and it has twice as many flowers as the straight species Phlox. So it makes twice as much nectar, and then twice as many butterflies come. And people say, see, cultivars are great. In that case, they are.
Yeah, sure.
But there's countless other examples where, in order to enhance the flower size of an echinacea, the nectar production is really slashed, or these double flowers, that takes the reproductive parts of the flower, the pollen and the nectar producers, and turns them into petals. So there's no pollen and no nectar.
Wow.
So it depends on which one you're talking about. The thing I don't like about cultivars is that they're typically reproduced clonally in order to maintain the trait, which means there's zero genetic variability in the cultivar. And genetic variability that's the stuff of evolution.
Sure.
You don't get adaptation if you don't have the genetic variability to allow the plant to choose the genes that are going to work under this particular situation.
Sure.
And with climate change and all the other stresses we're putting on plants, we want as much genetic variability as possible, not as little. People go to the nursery, and if that's all that's there, they can say, can you get me the straight species? And if the nurseryman says no, then don't buy something else. Leave. Say, okay, I'm going someplace else. When they realize, and they're starting to realize, that there is a market out there for straight species, they will start to carry them.
Sure.
They're just in business to sell plants. They're not in business to support the Chinese plants.
Exactly. My brother-in-law shared quite a few websites out there, and they send you the native species in a beautiful crate. They're wrapped in newspaper, and then, it's just this nice little tight box, and you pull them out, and voila, you've got beautiful natives that are shipped right to your home. You don't even need to go to Home Depot or Lowe's or the local nursery.
The local nursery it should always be better than Home Depot or Lowe's.
That is true. That is true.
Because hopefully they're getting their sources of plants more locally. Home Depot and Lowe's have a national distribution, and the plant you're buying, even though it's native, might be from Oregon or from someplace far away. Even if it's a species that grows near you, you want to get a genotype that's adapted to your particular situation. So locally sourced seeds are by far the very best.
With the amazing transformation you made to your property, you said 20 years ago, and Do you have 5 favorite plants that you have at your home? 5 favorites? And I know that you said you're in southern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, but that covers a very large region. So maybe you can point out your top 5.
My favorite plants are the ones that support the most moth species. So by far, that is the oaks on my property. I've been taking pictures of all the moth species I've found on our property in the last 4 years, and I'm up to 1,128 species of moths, and 30% of them are on my oaks. The next winner would be black cherry, Prunus serotina. Any of the native cherries are very high, followed by native willows. So on our property, that's black willow, but there are a number, as you move around the country, a number of willows. Those are all very high. So when I say a lot of species, in the mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 557 species of caterpillars. We call them keystone species because if you take them out of the food web collapses. The keystone is that stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take it out, the arch collapses. So these are essential plants in any ecosystem, and then you can diversify. Birches are very high. Hickories are very high. And then we got a number of other things. Black walnuts, a good plant. Maples are very high. Native maples, not Norway maple. And those are the big woodies. But out of the herbaceous plants, you already mentioned goldenrod. Mm-hmm. Perennial sunflowers are really productive plants. Evening primrose is a really productive plant. Asters. There's a lot of species of asters are all really productive plants. So they would all, that's more than 5, but those would be my top.
No, that's great. That's great. And you've actually developed a website.
It's National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder.
Yep.
And so it's, they developed the website using our data. People tend to give us too much credit. It's hard to make a website and get that programmer and everything else. And they did all that. What it does is allow you, wherever you are in the country, to put in your zip code and the best plants in terms of supporting those vital caterpillars for your county. Both woody plants and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. So it makes plant choice much easier than it used to be. People say, well, I don't know what to plant. Now you do know what to plant. Just put in your zip code and it's right there for you.
That's amazing. I've used it already. So I think I've kind of gone through our list, but is there anything else that you can think of that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I always like to end these conversations by trying to convince people that we need a new relationship with nature. In the past, we've had this adversarial relationship with nature. We're here and nature's someplace else. And if we interact with it, some people like it, but most people don't, and it's going to hurt us and it's terrible. We got to get rid of it. We need to change that to a collaborative relationship because we're products of nature. We're not going to survive without it. We're killing it. We're in the 6th grade extinction, and that is just not tolerable. I mean, it's not an option. We have to turn that around.
Sure.
So how do we do that? Caring is an important thing. Most people think they are totally separated from nature, so they don't think about being a good steward of the natural world around them. But everybody on the planet depends on a healthy ecosystem. Whether you like nature or not, you absolutely depend on it. That makes everybody responsible for good earth stewardship. Whether you own property or whether you don't, you are responsible for good earth stewardship. In how you treat the land, in how you vote, in what you do with your money. All these things are important in terms of good earth stewardship. So that's the message I'd like to get across. We've got to turn our relationship with the natural world around for our own good. This is a selfish act because we're not going to be here without it.
Couldn't agree more. I just think your work is so amazing, and I just really appreciate you coming on, and just wrote an article basically saying that this issue can be completely overwhelming, and to break it down into your own yard is just such an amazing thought. And like you said, 85% could be turned around if just people would take care of their own properties.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming if you think of the entire planet's problems. But if everybody just works on the part of the planet they can influence, if you don't own property, help somebody who does nearby. It all can be very local. There's a lot of us out there. There's 7.8 billion people out there, really. I mean, it's enough to turn this around if we all were on the same page.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.
I know our students are going to get a lot out of this.
All right. Good luck with your work.
All right. Thank you so much.